is. Okay, Renaud is here, and he will be doing the notes. Thank you. So most of you, on the email, you got your agenda. There are some changes to it, but not many. And we will follow the agenda. Most of the things have already been presented in the conference. We have only 35 minutes maybe, so we are going to kind of rush it a little bit. And also make sure that we clean up this room as we leave so that they can be ready for the next presentation of the conference. All right? So given that, we'll have the first update, next updates. Tim Hall. Yeah, you could go.
Except you. Yeah, so welcome. I have very little in terms of updates. However, I will say, this being the end of September and the end of our fiscal year and the new one starting in October, that regardless of what transpires, CMVP will continue operating at full strength, beginning, October 1st. And we have heard nothing about any shutdown, anything like that. But we will continue operating at, full capacity. And that's it.
All right. Thanks. Again, Tim made several presentations as all the other NEST folks, CMVP folks. So we have those things available to us anyway. All right. The next one is CCCS update. Kailai, please.
Well, typically during the monthly CMUF, when it comes to CCCS updates, Carolyn French is the one. So I'm a little surprised to see my name there. And she did not instruct me to say anything in this session. So just for the record, there's nothing to report at this level from CCCS.
No, you should say nothing new to report.
Nothing new to report.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Kailai. I just did say that you don't have to present it if you've already gotten all those statistics presented, which is the case. So ISO update, E or Carolyn? All right. I see neither of them, so I guess there are no updates, which is probably a good news too. All right. CMVP updates, Dave?
So again, I think we gave our update on Wednesday for this. The one thing I have to say, and then Kailai is going to come up, the manual revalidation scenario process that recently started, we said we were going to have a limit of 3 of those submissions per lab for us to get through the process. And I've gotten several questions this week about, well, when is that ending? And so I would just say, we've gotten probably about a dozen or so submitted. We're going to take probably a couple weeks, 2 weeks to get through kind of the process, see what we need to do, then be providing updated guidance and kind of release the limit. So it's not, I've gotten some sense that people thought this could be months, but more on the order of weeks. So I think that's the only update I have.
Right. So in addition to what Dave says, obviously throughout the conference, we know that the interim validation is going well. I just want to, I guess, remind in particular to the CSTLs that the checklist that CMVP program provided to you, please do make sure you check them through diligently. We want to, during the conference, the very first day, the CMVP presentation, we said that we're going to look into, in order for us to be able to, as we said, we said to bring the backlog down, we do need to look into a sustainable review process, which is predicated on increased basis of trust. And I did mention that information quality is important. So I think throughout the presentation, I hope that everyone here recognize that when we look at the queue, right, obviously the CMVP is the center of it, but it is a collaboration effort between the CMVP program and all 20 CSTLs. Let's work on this together. CMVP, we have recognized there's a room to improve. We're going to take that responsibility and to do so. And in return, we ask for the CSTLs to do so as well. So help us and help you. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Kaila. Thanks, Alex, for already setting yourself up.
That'd be efficient there.
IG updates, Alex.
Sure. So I'll make it quick. Since last CMUF, we basically have just done 2 changes. One is a withdrawn of one of the IGs, D.R on the hash functions acceptable for use in the 90A DRBGs. So we've removed that. You know, I think it came from the entropy working group, some discussions there, and you know, there's collaboration with the CT group, and you know, we agree that there wasn't a security concern to remove that IG. You know, it's more of a kind of a use case and efficiency-based you know, requirement. So that was the first one. And the second one is we added one IG C.0 for the requirements of 208 HSS vendor affirmation. So now there's an opportunity to include HSS algorithms within your module submission. You can vendor affirm them. There's some requirements in there for LMS testing, considering their similarities. And so there's the option now available and published. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So I need a correction here. It's not ENT, CAVP/ESV updates. Chris?
Yeah, thank you. So this year I did not give a presentation on CAVP updates, though you know, there's always something to update regarding that. So we have post-quantum testing available for FIPS 203, 204, 205. But the more exciting news that I had wanted to announce was that within the CAVP over the lifetime of ACVTS, we've served over 2.7 million vector sets across the demo and production environment, and we expect to cross 3 million by the end of the calendar year.
Wow.
Thank you. That's obviously a big team effort between everybody inside of the CAVP. So, you know, many of you interact with Bobby, Jason, Shane, Ben, Joel on GitHub and various other things. You know, definitely give them a round of applause too when you interact with them. Let them know how much you appreciate what they do, as I always do. But that was the major update there. In terms of ESV, during the entropy reviewer panel, we announced that there is currently no queue or a minimal queue, a queue of a small handful of reports. So this is a good time to submit your reports into the CMVP there. Yeah. It's not very often you get to come here and say there's no queue, so we'll take advantage of that when we can. Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah, no, we got to hire our first Fed for the first time in a very long time within the CAVP over the past month or so. His name is Noah Ross. You'll probably see him around on GitHub. He's working on our ASCON implementation for one of the new upcoming algorithms. You know, we're working in tandem with the document authors on ASCON, in addition on Falcon, FNDSA. Both are new algorithms working towards standardization. When we are ready, we will be communicating, you know, when we have testing available for those algorithms too. So, thank you.
One more round of applause for you and your team. Yeah, both ACVP and ESV has been really awesome. The turnaround is so good and so smooth that it's wonderful. So I do want to thank, before I go to Lisa on working group, I want to thank the CMVP for coming every month to the monthly meeting and being open to all kinds of suggestions, questions, and providing all your updates. So it's been really good communication, and the whole community thanks you for your time and effort there. I know it takes a lot to, do it on a month-by-month basis and also come up with that report. So thank you again. Now we go on to working group updates, and we have the Entropy Working Group, which is another great group. Lisa.
Thanks. I don't actually have anything to report, really, because I think our last meeting got canceled, but I did want to tell the group members we finally got 90C comments rolling in, so I'm going to call a meeting for next Tuesday. It's not our normal week, but I'm gonna set one and send out an invite, and then we're gonna make it 2 hours because we've already got 20 or 30 comments, and we've got more coming in. And the whole value is that the whole group, vets them before we submit them. So I'd like to just beg people to please dial in on Tuesday.
Thank you. RFG group, new group, but very, very good group. Keeps us all on our toes.
Okay, so my name's Trish Wolf. I'm with Cisco, but in this capacity, I'm the Request for Guidance Coordinator Leader. And also, I'm going to give you a quick break because we have flown through this, and I was allowed 3 minutes. And so in my 3 minutes, why should you not use beef stew as a password? It's not stroganoff. Okay, let's move on. So my meetings, you can see, are super fun. You really want to join them. But really, I want to talk about, this actually isn't new. We are at our 1-year anniversary, and this working group is a prime example of how CMVP CMVP and CCCS are collaborating with the community. So we actually are at 20 RFGs handled in the group, which doesn't sound like a lot, but these things are very complicated. We have 9 complete. We've got 3 that are in review with the CMVP. We've got 4 that are being drafted, and we have 4 new ones that are now in discussion. So we've conquered 20 different things across the year. These relate to, they are non-proprietary. But what is great about these submissions is we're making technical decisions that CMV reviews, accepts, they get posted, and then you can use them in your validations. And so a decision gets made that might get made for vendor A, but vendors B and C can use that same decision. So remember, these are non-proprietary. There is no requirement around the form factor that these can be, and they reach 4 results. They either reach hey, it gets posted as a response, and here's the technical decision. It results in an IG update. It can result in a new IG that Alex and team take, and they resolve. And the 4th thing is it can get passed to to a different working group. And we have passed to the CPU equivalency working group. We've passed to authentication. We've passed to other people as the issues get more complex. I do want to thank Alex. Alex is my partner on this, so we very much work hand in hand together, and this couldn't be done without his support. Also, thank you to the members who are very active. And the last thing I want to talk about, because I now have used my 3 minutes, is we did what we did. We did a revalidation or a review of our process, which, as we've heard all week long, reviewing your process is important. How do you make things better? And we realized that we need to get things through faster. So as I was looking at stats to see how quickly we were working through these things, we realized we need to move more quickly. So we're going to go to a couple changes. One, we're going to start meeting weekly. So there will be a weekly RFG working group every Wednesday from 12 to 1 Eastern. We are going to do you only get 2 shots. So if you're at the meeting, you come, if it takes 2 meetings, then we will move it to special meetings, and there will be a subset of the group that works on it, because we've had a couple that hang us up, and then everybody else queues up behind it. We are also going to ask the submitting organization, so the lab or the vendor, to come and attend the meeting so they can articulate the problem, answer questions, help us knock through these things more quickly. The next thing is we are going to start using the discussion boards a little more, and actually when there is some of them are very easy and we can resolve them in discussion boards. Other times we have to review them in meetings. The final thing we're going to do is we're going to quit pinning it all on me because I become a blocker, and that's a problem. And so what we're going to do is, once we reach a resolution, someone in the group is going to take to documenting that, and we're going to pass those around. So in the past, I've done all the resolution documenting. That doesn't work. You can't have everything back up on me. You don't want that. That shouldn't happen. So that's what we're going to do. So that's the group. You can see we're super fun, lots of jokes, but we also have lots of really good work to do. So if you are interested and you want to participate, please reach out. It is trwolf@cisco.com, and I will add you to the group. We really very much, this group only works through your participation because I don't know everything about every single crypto module and form factor, neither does Alex, and so we need you to participate. This is a community-driven group that only works with collaboration. Any questions?
I think Trish will take questions at the end.
Sounds
in
good.
the interest of time.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank
And we'll have an open house. Yeah, thank you, Trish, again. And yeah, all working groups are open to anybody and everybody, right? So many of the working groups have a focused question or focused subject, but RFG group takes all kinds of requests for guidance. So it could be any subject, and accordingly, Trish will focus it to maybe form a subgroup for things like, right now the subgroup that was formed, physical security came out of your RFG, right? So similarly, they'll split accordingly and form subgroups. So feel free to send Trish and maybe all the other leads as well an email. On our minutes, we will have the email addresses for each of the groups, leads of each of the subgroups, so you can contact them. All right, the next one is a single chip group. Mark Ireland was here, but then had to leave this afternoon, catch a flight. So he gave me a written summary. I'm going to read out the written summary. Single chip working group status. We continue to make progress on the hybrid module definition IG. This is currently a draft form and has undergone multiple rounds of comments. We are in the process of addressing all comments and finalizing the IG before sending it to the CMVP for their review and processing. We are currently meeting once a week at minimum, sometimes more, until the review and update process is completed. Since we have been working on this IG for many months now, we're doing our best to wrap it up quickly. So that's the update. So thank you to Mark for sending that. Mark's email address also will be on the minutes. So if you want to join this or have questions on his status, you're free to ask him. The next one is CPU equivalency. Kevin, I didn't see Kevin at the conference. Is there anybody else from CPU equivalency who would like to give a status update? I see no hands up. So we will skip that in that case. Physical security. Renaud, this is a fairly new group, and Renaud is here. Please.
Sorry.
Hi.
Yeah, so there's not much of an update. We're working on a draft implementation guidance on hardware equivalency. We started drafting it. They received some comments and are going to meet again on Tuesday to go through the comments and the updates. We meet every other week, and it's just basically, as you said, handling all the physical security comments that come along from the RFG working group, and hopefully tackling some of the other more important topics at long term. So.
Thank you, Renaud. All right, so that's the end of the working group updates. So I'm going to give one chance now to the audience or people on the phone if they have any question for either CMVP or for any of the working groups up till now. So we have a logical break here, sorry. So any questions whatsoever? All right, anything from the phone? Guess not. Okay, that's good. Everything is clear. And so, Erin, you take the phone. You take the microphone on
All right.
ICM's update.
Firstly, for everybody who's not in this room, shame on you. You should be at this conference. It's a great conference. Which is a nice segue into my topic, is next year's conference. Those here will have heard, and I think I've advertised it in the meetings, is in April 7th to the 10th in Toronto. The call for speakers will start appearing in your inboxes tomorrow. And we haven't got a lot of time.
That's right.
I don't have a lot of time, right? So do get your proposals in. There is some guidance about, especially about what to put in your abstract there. There's a couple of examples of good abstracts that we would like to see. Makes it much easier for those of us on the program committee that are reviewing the proposed submissions to understand what it is and where it would fit and that sort of thing. So it makes our job much easier and more likely for you to succeed in being accepted. There's going to be more information later in the conference after the summary panel about sort of what the direction is there. I'd also ask, if you're going to be submitting, don't submit sort of something that was at this conference. I know there's not an awful lot of time between this one and the next one, but we would like to see new stuff if we can, updates where necessary, but new that we can. And hope to see all of you in Toronto. We're awfully friendly. Okay.
Thanks, sir. And so the key thing here is that ICMC is moving to spring, starting next year, right? So that's that. So one thing I missed is to say thank you to the working group leads. So please. All right. So now comes the most interesting part. I don't think you knew about this, but will be the most interesting news from here. So the steering committee are expanding. So we are planning to go from 7 members. Currently, there are 7 members at the steering committee, and and 4 of them are from the lab and 3 from vendors. So we want to go to a 10, strength of 10, with 5 from the lab and 5 from the vendors. Okay, so the current members are Chris. Is Chris here? Okay, there he is, Chris. Marita is not here for the conference. He is there, you all know E. Ryan, no Ryan here. And Anantha, I don't see Anantha either, maybe he left. Oh, okay, you're standing. So I was watching everyone in the sitting position. Sorry, Nitya, that's me. So we plan on doing 5 plus 5. Oh, Trish. How did I miss you, Trish? Yeah, sorry, Trish. Trish, as you can see on the thing, Trish is also there. Sorry about that. So we will be 5 labs and 5 vendors, which means we have an open position for 1 more lab and 2 more vendors. All right. So having said that, so there are some responsibilities of the SC members, and also some. And we have some selection criteria as well. So these are going to be, currently there is the current charter is available in that link. Of course, you'll have all that link in there, but it's in the CMUF website. If you do charter, find on charter, and then you can see it. It is getting updated because it's currently still the old format with 8 as the open positions and things like that. So it's getting updated, and hopefully I will get it out, the complete one, the updated one, by the 27th. It may happen much before that, but I just gave myself a couple of 1 week. And we are looking for candidates from different organizations who are not already represented. That's one of the things that I want to mention, that if your organization is already, organization or its affiliate is already represented, then we are not looking for that kind of candidates. So if you are interested, you should send a brief note on your experience with FIPS. We are focusing more on FIPS rather than just crypto. And any community, that's another aspect that we're looking at, your community or working group involvements and how you feel you could better the SC interaction. So what we do is we interact with CMVP, we interact with you. If you remember when we had that interim solution was presented, then we had meetings on that, we analyzed it, we had presented that to CMVP from all the minutes. That's one of the things too. We are basically a glue between CMUF, within the CMUF community to the CMVP community. So, please do consider, and we're going to accept your interest emails till the October 11th so that we can post it by, we can select somebody by October 18th. So it's for suitable candidates. So we may be able to get all 3 candidates, or we may still have things open. I just want to put that out now so that you don't feel that if we choose only one and not fill the whole position, that nobody is disappointed. So we're looking for the right candidate. That's the key here. All right, and I'll also post this in the community events so that those who have not had a chance to either be at on the phone or be here, all of them, everybody knows it, right? We are all subscribed. Most people are subscribing to the events, so we will post it on the events. So having said that, I think we have a few minutes. So any questions now? Wow, silence. All right, if we don't have any questions, going 1, going 2, and going 3. If you don't have any questions, you've seen all the SC members. Trish, again, sorry. And please feel free to ask them, catch them today and ask them if you have any additional questions. And of course, we are, I think I didn't mention this, so I want to mention again that please send your note to sc@cmuf.org, and we will all get that, so we will take a look at that. All right, thank you very much for sharing your lunch time with us, and have a good rest of the conference.
All right, hope everyone had a good lunch and catching up with peers and networking. So this is presented by Graham Costa, who is Security and Certification Manager from Thales, and he's going to present on the topic Module Component Pre-Validation Packages, Enhancing Reusability for Scalable Certifications. Graham, please take over.
Hello. So yeah, I'm Graham Costa, and I've got a relatively long presentation. I'm sure there'll be time for questions, some questions, on what I've called module component pre-validation packages. So I've broken the presentation down into 4 sections. We're going to start by talking a little bit about background challenges. Before looking forward, I've kind of got some slides where we're going to talk a little bit about what other schemes do, in particular common criteria in CESIP in relation to reuse. I've got a section about module component pre-validation packages where we'll talk a little bit more about what these could be, what these are, how these might work. And then I've got a conclusion and next steps. So starting out with background and challenges. Reuse of evidence, fairly common sense thing, is essentially the foundation to most scalable certifications. But within the context of 140-3, there's limited guidance and limited options in relation to reuse, where at the moment it's basically limited to CAVP, ESV, and binding and embedding certified modules. Talking a little bit more about some of them. So binding and embedding certified modules, there was a recent IG which looked to clarify a lot of the requirements around how this can be done in IG 1.A. Although it is useful in some circumstances, it's generally only practical in a very narrow set of circumstances where there's a couple of conditions I've outlined. The module being bound or embedded is a complete certified module, and that's probably the most important takeaway. The target security levels need to be matched for bound modules. And as one of the most difficult things today, and I think why you don't see more bound and embedded modules, ultimately, if you're a module certification that has a bound or embedded component, you inherit the sunset date of whatever the earliest component is within that. So in many cases, depending on the components you've used, that can significantly devalue the resulting certificate. Some cases it doesn't matter if you're just doing certification for some contractual obligation, but a lot of the time you want to maximize the amount of time your certificate is valid. Very final point, at the moment, there's generally, having looked at the management manual, there's no real practical guidelines in FIPS 140 linked to reuse of test results for partial modules. And that's essentially what this presentation is looking to focus on. Some cryptographic module trends. So just as part of background, I thought it was useful to go into some of the things that are driving some of the challenges that from the vendor side of things we have to deal with and are increasingly having to deal with. The first one is that a lot of the system compliance requirements are driving a need for broader product certifications. There was a time where FIPS and related certifications were very much a checkbox, that if you had a certificate, that was enough. Now that system compliance is a big business, people have cyber risk insurance, they have audits related to steps that they've taken to mitigate system risks. If they have certified cryptographic devices, then auditors are very interested in what the scope of those devices are, whether all the relevant security functions have been covered, and what assurance activities had taken place. And a lot of the time that's leading us, or leading our product managers from the vendor side, to look at and consider increasing the scope of certifications compared to what maybe they've been in the past. Second trend, although trend that's been going on for a long time. Very few modules are exclusively developed from IP from a single vendor. This creates a number of different challenges. From the perspective of managing a certification, it does mean that you need to get inputs from multiple vendors into the certification. And in some cases, depending on how the interfaces are working, it means that a test lab may need to interface with two vendors as part of getting the information they need to perform the assurance activities to complete a certification. So this can lead to delays, it can lead to increased costs, and kind of moving on to the second point, in some cases it can create some challenges around protecting IP. So as a vendor, we could quite often use third-party components from vendors where it makes sense to buy in things, but a lot of the time we're also competitors of the third party. And so for certain areas, vendors are very tight with regards to their IP and who can see it and providing information, and where in some cases where they're happy to work with a test lab to tell whatever their secret sauce is as to how something works, they may be hesitant to tell us as a competitor vendor exactly how things are working. And the final one is that for many products, I mean, certification is something that's increasingly becoming more widely a need for lots of different products for lots of different reasons. Quite often those products weren't developed with certification in mind, and that can lead to challenges and delays leading to sharing IP with test labs if appropriate agreements haven't been put in place. Final one, one of the most challenging ones is that compared to a decade ago, chip vendors or library vendors cooperating with third-party certifications was kind of something that companies did as part of the deal of taking on their components. As kind of part of the avoiding us implementing things. But as the number of certification goes up and the number of different products these components are going into also increases, it's getting increasingly difficult to get third parties to agree to be involved in certifications for individual products. And this can lead to delays, and in many cases this can even lead to roadblocks that avoid certifications becoming a viable thing. So, moving forward, what would vendors like? Very top level, this all basically boils down to having some kind of formal path to reuse evaluation evidence without the need to repeat test activities. If we can achieve that, then this in turn leads to improved options to break down and stage certification activities for complex modules. Many of today, with boundaries increasing, modules can be developed over extended periods of time, and really there's a desire to perform testing activities as we go, rather than leaving it until the end. If we can solve those two things, then that ultimately, hopefully, leads to a path for library and component suppliers to meet their certification obligations, where, as happens in some other certifications, they can contractually meet obligations linked to certifications once, and then the results from testing activities on a given component is reused, can feed into a number of different other vendor certifications downstream. So before going too much into MCPVP, I thought it was useful to have a look a little bit for people that weren't familiar as to what other schemes do. And two that came to mind and I decided to pull out were Common Criteria and CESIP. So in a CC world, I'm sure most people here know, but CC is essentially the benchmark for componentized assurance claims. And it's widely adopted to solve a lot of the problems that I've outlined in the previous slides. Quoting from CC Part 1, it essentially has composition as a solution as to how you independently certify different components and then put them together to make a higher order product. Composite evaluation technique describes a way to perform transfer of knowledge as an important point, and reuse of evidence. Critical to this approach and the success of this approach for CC, and one of the big differences between CC and FIPS is that in a CC world, you have a catalogue of security requirements and assurance activities, and you have the option to tailor them to the threats of each component. That's essentially the secret sauce of CC. That means that it's been so successful in dealing with the kind of integration of smaller bits of products, and then getting independent certificates and then being able to stack them or build them up into a higher order product. How does it do that? It has assurance class, ACO, or assurance composition, which in turn leverages composed assurance packages. And these essentially cover the evaluation activities linked to composed tool, where that would mean that overall certified component would have components within it that have their own certificates in their own right. Very much in the 20,000 foot assurance activities for composition check many things. In particular, they check the dependencies between the components to make sure that all the requirements for security are met. And in the CC world, they also check that no vulnerabilities were introduced as part of the integration of the two components. So if you test two components independently and you put them together, you don't necessarily end up with a component that's secure. An important thing, and kind of one of the cruxes that I kind of wanted to highlight, so we've got bold and a box. The CC methodology for composition avoids the need for component vendors to be directly involved in downstream composite evaluations. So that means that once you've done your certification, other products can consume your component and they can use the outputs of your certification in a way that essentially allows test labs to complete certifications without needing to go back to the original vendor for them to be involved. And that becomes the key to scalability. Very much looking at the kind of classic example, so just an example to make clear. Kind of tailored this one for the federal government by making it a PIV card. What would happen in this situation would be that the chip vendor may certify their devices against various PP as a secure hardware IC. That would be considered the base tool, and that certification would be done by vendor A and test lab A. The output of that is a document called the Evaluation Technical Report for Composition. That gets fed into any subsequent evaluation looking to use that component. And as part of that report, it includes all the information you need to understand the dependencies, the assurance activities that were taken part as part of the base certification, and basically everything you need to know to consume that component safely. With permission, that could get fed to Test Lab B, and they would be responsible for doing the certification activities for another layer in the product. So that could be a Java Card OS and a PIV applet, or as typically would happen, those would be split, but I put them together here for simplicity. As part of that certification for the composed tool, the test lab would look at how they went together, check that all the dependencies were met, and then that would lead to a composite tool that ultimately would have its own certificate. I've added some additional notes, some minor things that there wasn't time to go into. Each layer in the product can have non-tool components, so they would be parts of the thing that was integrated that weren't necessarily assured. And CC also has the idea of multi-assurance, which is a way to deal with the situation where you have different certified components and you put them together, but the assurance claims for each are different. Keep in mind that in the CC world, the security requirements are the same. It's mainly the assurance activities that go into validating that the security requirements have been met that change. So if you have different ELs for different components, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're mismatched or one's less secure than the other one. It just means that less rigor has gone into reviewing that they actually meet the claims that they meet. For the second example, CESIP. So for anyone who wants a broader background in CESIP, there was a good presentation on Wednesday by Olivier from Global Platform, who went into CESIP in detail and about what it does. But in short, it's a scheme that's been developed with a view to developing security assurance schemes for the Internet of Things. Kind of as a common theme and link to this, one of the cited CESIP goals from the standard is reuse of evaluation results in different products and between different standards to avoid redundant evaluation of the same product parts without adding value, which I think we can all agree is something that we'd all like. CESIP and how it does things is very similar to CC, and it builds on the kind of established way of doing things. It has a catalogue of tailored security requirements. It has suites of assurance activities, and it also, importantly, has assurance activities dedicated to composition and multi-assurance. I've added a note at the bottom that although CESIP was a global platform standard and has been around for a while, it has relatively recently been adopted as a CEN EN. So it's a European standard now, 1797/2023 that you can look up. It's a very quick example of CESIP, so this is, you may struggle to read, but this is an example that's given in the CESIP standard of a composed tool. I wanted to call out a couple of things. One is that the components at the bottom tend to be the higher assurance components, be it the foundations, the hardware, the secure bootloader, that kind of thing. They tend to be the things that are used across many products and where the vendor can invest in higher levels of assurance. You'll see in the diagram a load of arrows. As an output of each of the individual components in its certifications, they will have implementation guidance that will say how to use that component securely as part of a composition. One of the core things of CESIP is to look at the composition of components and make sure that all the different interdependencies are met. And finally, as part of putting all these components together as part of an assured tool, they have something called a certificate for composition, which ultimately is the thing that sets out how all the different components go together and what level of assurance has been met as far as making sure that they work as they're meant to. So, moving on to module component pre-validation packages. Looking back, some of the things that I guess from researching I think I've learned from CC and CESIP and also just applying their principles to some of our products. The flexibility to choose suites of requirements is an important thing. This is the thing that really makes those schemes successful, and being flexible and being attractive to lots of different schemes, lots of different verticals, lots of different markets. It's something that isn't always put across, but integration is important. It's not just about getting results and reusing them. Having mechanisms and framework in place to make sure that reuse of the results is appropriate, and the dependencies that weren't met during the base certification are met in subsequent integrations. This is an important thing to build into any process around reusable results. Composition requires evaluation, so yeah, both vendors need to have the information they need to successfully integrate things, but then this needs to be evaluated. And then finally, there is some value in establishing common suites of requirements. So, moving into 140-3 land, where we'll stay for the rest of the presentation, is there a solution for FIPS 140-3? So, unlike CC and setup, one of the big drawbacks or challenges we have with 140-3 is that it has a fixed set of functional requirements. So today there really isn't the option to say, I'm an authentication library, I meet all the requirements for authentication, but I don't meet the rest, but can I do something that allows me to be tested and for my results to be consumed by later certifications? CAVP and ESV, we're all familiar with them. These are examples of successful reusable results. They are foundations of the program today, but they're narrow, and they're very custom. So what kind of this presentation is looking to propose is the creation of a more flexible framework, and I've called it module component pre-validation packages, to allow for more flexible creation of reusable results. What the scheme would look to do would be to allow the evaluation against a subset of applicable FIPS 140-3 requirements, learning from what's been done in CC and CESIP. It would look to generate guidance around how to reuse those packages, and very much the aim would be on fundamental. I don't think it works if it's not achieved. Those packages need to be reusable in a repeatable way, and without having to go back and retest everything. I added a footnote here that if people are going deja vu, I've heard about this before. This whole idea did come from the bound and embedded group within the CMUF, where I kind of came up with this idea as part of discussions that were there. So what would MC PVP testing look like? It would very much look like what you would expect, I think. So the first step would be that the vendor would decide, based on what their component did, what requirements were applicable. They would have to record this in some kind of document. I call it security target. It could be something else. They need to identify the boundary of what they want to certify, and that would form the boundary of the interfaces as far as consuming the results. And thinking ahead, they would also identify all the content that is required as far as things that go into security policies. So like lists of CSPs, lists of security functions, list of secure functions and interdependencies. That vendor would engage a test lab. They would be an NVLab accredited test lab, and they would essentially, kind of as part of step 3, they would look to identify the VE and TE that were relevant to the requirements that had been identified. And they would develop tailored code review and test plans for the testing activities that they would expect to do for that library if it was part of a bigger product that was going through a full certification. The test lab would then do the testing with support of the sponsoring vendor. And as an output, the test lab would then complete what I'm kind of strongly calling the module component pre-validation package for tested components. And that would essentially be that if you were a third-party vendor, what you would do, and then there was this package that could then be used as part of downstream certifications. Kind of moving on from there as to what happens to that, kind of envisaging that there's sort of 2 different models as how that could be used. In some circumstances, that package is something that could be shared between labs. So almost as if a test lab has subcontracted some testing to a third-party test lab would send that package to the other lab. They would get that package. It would have the information they need to understand what testing had been done and what things they needed to check as part of checking integration worked. The other model, if you're a big vendor and you have shared components against lots of multiple related products, then maybe it's the same test lab that reuses that package, but more formally is allowed to reuse that package as evidence without going back to retesting everything, provided all the conditions are met. And then ultimately we get to the end, which is where the final test lab would use the information in the package. They would complete their web cryptic report. They would look at the assurance activities custom to this scheme to make sure the integration and reuse of the results is appropriate. And then that would then move on as a normal module through to certification. What would the output of MC PVP look like? So one of the important things, and this is why I think this might be successful versus some other options, The whole idea is, this is about reuse of evidence. We need to avoid situations where there's a report generated, there's a certificate generated, we get market confusion with like partial FIPS 140-3 certificates. We're really just looking to create a way whereby, the best way to think about it is like third-party test lab subcontract some testing to some another one, and you do the testing of parts of a product and then bring it all together. The package would have information about identification, target platforms, dependencies, list of assertions that were tested, test evidence. So the important thing here is that ultimately the consuming lab needs to fill out and have the information they need for the web cryptic report as if they tested it themselves. So this package would look to include that information that they can then carry across into the web cryptic report. Maybe there's better ways to do it in the future where there's a reference, but it seems the simplest thing to do from the start. And then as kind of covered when talking about security target, there would be the relevant inputs to security policies that a consuming lab would need. I've listed the secondary content because I know it's a lot more contentious and it could be a sticking point, but if there was the option to port the results between different hardware platforms, maybe these packages would include tailored instructions on how to do that. So there's been a lot of discussion about how to take subchip modules and use them on different hardware platforms or integrate them with different ICs as part of the RFG questions we've been dealing with recently. Maybe that's something that would also fall into this package. A little bit about requirements templates. So I think MCPVP would be most flexible if it wasn't mandated that there were these templates. However, learning from the success of other schemes, maybe they're helpful for specific categories of products where the same kind of thing's done over and over again, so we can establish what the template is and what the requirements are, and then that's something that can then be used by industry. They may also be usable for test labs and vendors who are planning for testing. If they don't have to go and find all the requirements, then we get better consistency if they've already been established as to what are suitable sets of requirements to be tested. Kind of going into that, but recognizing we're running a little bit out of time. These are some of the targets for common things that we thought maybe could be targets where templates were required. Just picking some of them, so random bit generator. This is something we see very commonly, hardware chip that has the noise source plus the DRBG and all the stuff that goes with it. At the moment, you can get an ESV cert for the noise source, but then you have to cover it independently as part of a downstream certification, the DRBG, the CAST, zeroization of temporary CSPs, other things that are not covered by ESV. It'd be really great if they could all be wrapped up, and then the chip vendor that's selling our out-the-box random bit generator can cover all their responsibilities, and then a lab downstream can consume that and be like, oh, here's a chip, it's being used. I've got the package of evidence and information from someone else that says that all these requirements have been checked and it's all good. Renaud was talking in the previous presentation in this session about physical security. It's another thing. You could test things, the hardware hasn't changed, the requirements haven't changed. This should be something that should be reused. And maybe MCPVP is, if you create that package, maybe that's a way to dealing with reuse. Just highlighting one last thing for templates, a real problem I see coming in the future with non-invasive, I'm going to go with when rather than if, but when we get to non-invasive, lots of people reuse crypto libraries and crypto hardware. It's a very specialist thing, it's a common thing to be bought in. At the moment, third-party vendors meet their certification obligations by doing CAVP certs. When it comes to non-invasive testing, vendors and IP related to side channel protection, this is something that they do not like to share. And this is one of the core things of how the CC world for smart cards and similar things work in the way it works. I mean, one option is like a CAVP plus reusable certification, but maybe MCPVP could be the thing where that vendor says, I've got the CAVP cert, and then look, I've also done the due diligence and the stuff I need to do to cover the non-invasive testing requirements and possibly zeroization requirements, and that gets consumed by a downstream certification. So, conclusion and next steps. I'm not going to go through these. I really put them all on the slide to basically as a brain dump of things that are in my head as to things that are worth discussing. There's lots of questions. This is not a complete proposal. It raises more questions than it answers. Generally where I want to go with this is to create a group of people to discuss it more. There's a lot of, I think it is a useful concept. I think it's also fundamentally a needed concept, but I do recognize that it is challenging status quo, and challenging a lot of very hard boundaries that there are today with regards to how evidence is developed and how evidence is reused, and in particular trying to challenge status quo with regards to allowing evidence to be shared between different labs and to be consumed. So final slide, compartmentalization of assurance activities. I think this is a growing challenge. I think if FIPS is to be successful as a standard going forward, it's something that needs to be tackled. For sure, it's not going to get solved overnight, but it's a fundamental problem that's just pushing certain markets and certain users potentially of FIPS away from FIPS because of those rigid requirements and the inability to split modules down more effectively with a view to reusing results. MCVP could be the solution, but at the same time I'm open-minded that there might be other ones. Maybe it's easier to address things like CAVP plus or ESV plus as short-term fixes to real-world problems. But MCPVP could be a flexible framework that, if created, allows us to solve problems that we don't yet know that we've got. As my final kind of next step, I'm going to create a thread on the CMUF around this, and if anyone wants to collaborate with regards to tackling some of the questions I had on the previous slide, providing feedback as to whether this is useful, or whether you're willing to contribute as part of creating some more kind of concrete proposal to CMVP on the topic, then please get in touch. And that's me. Thank you very much. Questions or support? Lots of people saying, I agree, we should do something.
Hi, so I need a lot more time to noodle over the concept here, but do you have any thoughts or impressions of how an MCPVP might fit into the context of a common criteria protection profile?
I think not. So really the focus or the laser focus of this is about FIPS. So it's about how do you create these packages of information that can be passed between different parties as part of a certification. That's really the focus. If they become things that can be consumed by like NIAP, CC, things like that, they almost become this like partial FIPS certificate type thing, which is what I really want to avoid. I think anything that goes down it's kind of like half FIPS is just a bad thing. Really the focus is on pragmatic reuse of evidence to solve a lot of problems that we got today or that are coming up. As soon as we kind of open it and say, well, no, this is about information and how that might relate to CC, NIAP, CC, things like that, then I think we end up with all sorts of other challenges about what is this thing.
Sure.
So, yeah, laser focus, reuse of evidence, and the best way I come to think about it is just really imagine that the other test lab that's validating this component is just a subcontractor to like the other one. They can pay them for access to it. It's trying to be as simple as that,
Okay.
with a view to, if I'm dealing with a third-party vendor and they're saying, well, I'm happy to do something that, I do the testing once and it can then be reused by the community. This is the kind of thing I want to solve. Because at the moment, it works for CC because we can pick the requirements and create the tight focus certifications. But with FIPS today, we just don't have the option. It's kind of like all or nothing apart from CAVP and ESV.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
That's okay.
Like the idea, have you considered involving the CMVP in the process, maybe after the lab completes their review? One thing we've seen, different labs will have different interpretation of requirements, interpretation of op testing, source code review to maintain portability. I'm just worried if we do all this effort to get a component validated with lab A, take it to lab B, and they say, wait a minute, that's not the way we should do this, or that's not compliant.
Yeah, I got a minute left and I'm aware that someone's going to throw off and it's a topic I could talk like for half an hour on. It's on the list of questions. I mean, there's loads of questions up there like, if you do this MCPVP thing and IG's changed, then how does that work? It's not a certificate. Current thinking would be you probably have to go back and address it. But that would be something as part of a bigger proposal that there needs to be a mechanism that these MCPV things change or can be updated so that they can be reused. But yeah, there's a question on that list if you look, when you look at the slides around CMVP, should they be involved? Is there any sign off there? Is there any value? Gut feeling is no. I don't think it's something they want to get involved in or get addressed. And really, if we have a process around how it works, how risks and threats with it are dealt with, so it's not just, oh, it's been tested by someone else, yeah, tick that box, copy the results across. There needs to be that, is that testing valid? Have the dependencies that were outlined at the start, are they met? So, if you're a crypto library and you've just said for your crypto library component, I'm going to assume that I've got an RBG attached to that interface, then, when it comes to the overall product and is the RBG attached to the interface, that's something someone needs to check. I'm rambling now and at the end of my time, but yeah, there's loads of questions, and what I really want to do is create a discussion within the CMUF where hopefully we kind of find the sweet spot of what's useful and what maybe solves some real world problems in the short term, and then also treading this ground with what is CMVP thinking might be palatable. So, immediate feedback on, yeah, this is never going to go, you're wasting your time, versus maybe there's something in it if you address these questions. That could be something for the CMUF to start with and possibly work on.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
CMUF group, and thanks again. So I would like to move on to the next presentation by Apurva Varalikar, Lab Manager, Acumen Security, and presenting on decoupling applets from smart card, Java card validations.
Thank you, Sowndar. All right, so a Java application essentially is an application written in Java, which is then compiled and delivered to the end user in the form of bytecode. So a typical FIPS cryptographic boundary for an applet validation would comprise of the underlying single chip on which the applet will be loaded, where the single chip then forms the cryptographic boundary. And this essentially means that even if the single chip has been previously validated, the combination has to be taken through validation again, which can be really onerous. So the main objective of this talk is to provide alternatives to this approach. Prior to moving on, I'd also like to call out that the operational environment in which the applet executes is also inherited from the single chip. So apart from the operational environment, there's other aspects of a single chip validation that an applet can leverage, such as the cryptography. And this also implies that the underlying single chip is then responsible for meeting the associated FIPS requirements. So an applet could just be designed to call into the underlying single chip for all of the cryptographic implementations without implementing any additional cryptography of its own. Next is physical security, and essentially regardless of what the crypto boundary happens to be, the physical boundary is always going to be the single chip. So in other words, the single chip is responsible for meeting the associated physical security requirements at the target security level. And finally, we have ESB, and of course, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but speaking of ESB, as all of us know, an entropy source is required in support of a module that generates IVs and keys. Now with FIPS, ESB essentially is a prerequisite to submitting a module to CMVP, whereby the entropy source has to be validated separately and must achieve its own FIPS certificate. So assuming there's sufficient entropy provided to the applet to generate keys at the desired security strength, the same entropy source and the ESB cert could be leveraged from the single chip validation for the applet validation. Okay, so next, a bit of history on 140-2 and how it delved into Java applets. So with 140-2, at least there were a couple IGs touching upon this topic and taking into account the applets. So one of the IGs essentially said that an applet could be validated on a single chip as part of the base single chip validation, or could be validated separate and then loaded onto the underlying single chip, which has also previously undergone a validation. Another IG essentially took into account porting of an applet from one single chip to another. So, the point I'm trying to make here is 140-2 had some consideration for this use case, right, for the applet validation separate from the single chip. this guidance does not have seemed to have made it into 140-3. So it might be, something to look into and for us to essentially inherit some best practices from 140-2 on this front. All right, so prior to going into the proposed solutions, I'd like to reiterate the problem statement, right? So the problem I'm trying to propose solutions for is where you have an applet that needs to undergo a FIPS validation and it doesn't implement any crypto of its own. So it's really, like I said, onerous for the applet vendor to go in and work with a lab and take the full validation route, which is really tedious. So that's where the objective is to reduce the scope of validation as much as possible and, to Graham's point, reuse as much as we can. Sorry about that. All right, so the two solutions that I'd like to propose, first is binding to, and you can read it as binding to / embedding in the underlying single chip. So this is, crudely speaking, a concept in FIPS where one module can be tethered to another, the drawback being that the module that's tethered to the base validated module will also inherit the sunset or the expiry from its certificate. The positive being that the applet, when loaded on the single chip, can be bound or embedded in the single chip. And essentially, because the two certificates are associated, the underlying single chip is then responsible for meeting a number of the requirements that the applet alone could not satisfy. Sorry, I keep doing this. Next is, a dedicated submission scenario for this use case, which is essentially when an applet is being loaded onto a smart card. And this would sort of be akin to what is known as the UPDT submission scenario in 140-3. So UPDT essentially allows less than 30% of code changes to be made to a module and for the new version of the module to be validated. So what we would essentially need here is a customized UPDT scenario. Regardless of the route we follow, the common requirement is going to be to have a predefined regression test suite in place, which essentially focuses on the delta set of requirements that an applet validation would have to satisfy over and above the base single chip validation. All right, so on those lines, next up is a 10,000-foot overview of the 140-3 requirements, specifically the additional ones that the applet must satisfy, or rather the applet validation must consider and satisfy over and above the base single chip. All right, so section 1 general does not add any requirements, but section 2 cryptographic module specification could, depending on whether there's any additional steps required to enable the approved mode and load and initialize the applet, sort of like a pre-personalization phase on the underlying single chip. Also, depending on the crypto implementations within the applet, additional modes of operation might come into the picture. So for instance, if the applet implements a non-approved algorithm, whereas the underlying single chip does not, that would introduce the non-approved mode of operation. Another example is, let's say the applet has additional approved crypto in it, and one of the algorithms fails its test, known as a self-test in FIPS. And that causes the applet to inhibit output from itself, but not the entirety of the single chip. This essentially causes a scenario where you have a reduced throughput. In FIPS terms, this is known as a degraded mode of operation. So essentially, depending on the crypto implementations, additional modes and the associated requirements could come into the picture. All right, so section 3 is ports and interfaces, and by and large, the requirements for this section pertain to the pins of the chip, which in this case are the ports of the module. Another thing a lab must do is look at all the APIs of the applet and segregate them into the different logical interface types under 140-3. Also, the lab is responsible for verifying how the information flowing to and from the module is logically segregated. So the data input, output, control input, output, and status output, how that is logically separated must be assessed, especially when sharing a physical port, which in this case is just the pin of the chip. All right, so role, services, and authentication is next. By and large, the requirements of this section would apply both to the applet as well as the single chip, but ultimately it depends on the implementations in the applet. So if the applet is designed to support additional roles and authentication mechanisms, sure, those requirements would come into the picture. But 9 out of 10 times the applet is going to introduce new services. So the associated requirements would thus apply. An instance of an additional requirement that will apply to the applet validation but not the underlying single chip is that of self-initiated crypto output. So this is a 140-3 concept wherein after an initial one-time configuration, the module automatically provides crypto output. So let's say the single chip just has crypto primitives that it supports for TLS, and the applet contains the entirety of the TLS stack. So what this means is that the single chip cannot support automatic crypto output because it can't negotiate the TLS sessions on, automatically, but the applet could. So the additional requirements pertaining to self-initiated crypto output would apply to the applet validation even as they don't to the underlying single chip. Next is software firmware security. By and large, the requirements for this section pertain to loading of external software or firmware onto the single chip and the integrity protection of all the code within the module. So in terms of loading from an external source, because the applet is being loaded onto the single chip, naturally the single chip is then responsible for meeting the associated requirements. In case of an integrity check, most of the times, when an applet is loaded on the single chip, the mechanism in the single chip will essentially cover the applet code as well. In the instance that the chip is not designed so, it's of course the applet vendor's responsibility to then implement the mandatory integrity check and meet the associated requirements. Okay, so next is operational environment, and I've already mentioned this in the past. The OE is inherited from the underlying single chip. So at least at level 1, the underlying single chip is then responsible for meeting the associated requirements. If the module intends to claim a level 2 or higher overall, it would also imply that section 7 physical security is then claimed at that higher level, which essentially means that the requirements per this section would not apply. And that's just per the ISO 19790 on which 140-3 is based. All right, so physical security, again, something I mentioned in the past, regardless of what the crypto boundary is, the physical boundary is the underlying chip, ergo the chip is responsible for meeting the associated requirements. Next is the non-invasive security. So if the applet is specifically designed to mitigate side channel attacks, attacks that don't require physical access, timing-based attacks being an example, then the requirements for this section would apply. At this time, it just involves a documentation exercise where the vendor is supposed to disclose the mitigations and provide the corresponding documents for the lab's review. And at this time, they need to vendor affirm the effectiveness of the mitigations implemented as part of Section 12, mitigation of other attacks. Okay, so that brings me to Section 9, SSP management. And this essentially, SSP is an umbrella term for CSPs and PSPs, critical security parameters and public security parameters. So critical parameters could be IVs, private keys. Public parameters are, of course, public keys and certificates. So sensitive security parameters essentially are related to the services, authentication mechanisms, and the crypto implemented in a module. So depending on whether the applet implements any additional services, authentication mechanisms, and cryptography, there could be additional SSPs specific to the applet, which then, for those SSPs, the applet vendor would have to meet the associated requirements for Section 9 for the entire life cycle of those SSPs. Section 10 is self-testing. If the applet does not contain any additional cryptography of its own, then it's a complete leverage from the single chip, and the applet vendor does not need to satisfy any additional requirements, and that's assuming the integrity check for the applet is taken care of by the single chip as well. In the event that the applet does implement cryptography, then the applet vendor naturally must satisfy the requirements per IG 10.3a and implement the corresponding self-tests, as well as any other IGs that would apply based on the list of algorithms supported. All right, so section 11, lifecycle assurance, the requirements for this section would in fact apply to both the single chip and the applet, and that's because the requirements apply to a product or a module as a whole and throughout its life cycle, right from its development or inception to deployment, maintenance, and through its end of life. So that brings me to the last and final section in 140-3, mitigation of other attacks. So this is quite similar to section 8 in that there aren't any test-related requirements at this time, but if an applet is specifically designed to mitigate any attacks, then those attacks have to be declared, documented, enumerated in section 12 of the security policy. This is in fact a mandate. You cannot, implement a mitigation and not declare it. It's completely optional to mitigate any attacks or implement mitigations in the first place, but if an applet vendor does, then they must disclose them. And like I said, it's a documentation exercise. They have to be enumerating the attacks and the mitigations implemented as part of section 12 of the security policy. And if you're trying to achieve a security level higher than level 1, then at the higher levels, additional documentation has to be provided for the lab's review, proving the effectiveness of those mitigations. All right, so that brings us to the next steps, and the next steps really are quite obvious. It would involve forming a CMUF, working group, or taking this further as part of the existing single chip working group. And the objective really is to focus on the delta set of requirements that an applet invariably must satisfy, and to the best extent possible, leverage the groundwork painfully done by the single chip vendor already. Because as mind-boggling as it might be, not everyone enjoys doing FIPS as much as I do. So completely understand that the radius needs to be reduced. Okay, so that's it from my end. I hope this was informative, somewhat informative, and thank you for your time. Any questions? I'm glad you got up. I have a question for you as well that I couldn't squeeze in.
Well, yeah, I guess we've got plenty of time to have a discussion.
Yes.
So Thales is a Java card
Yep.
supplier, and so this is a problem space that we're intimately familiar with. I didn't get the UPDT thing and why that needed to be custom, and if you're just adding firmware to an existing certification, is this not just a UPDT? So
here's the thing, depending on what the applet is adding, it may not even need to go to that scope, right, of a UPDT, which is really addressing the additional FIPS requirements. So I'm trying to, get at something that would be between like a one sub and a UPDT situation, where you have a custom, to your point about a template, right? There would be a preset regression suite that this scenario would follow. Assuming there's no crypto implementations in the applet, of course, we'd have to have two sets of templates created, taking into account the scenario, the off chance that there is some FIPS-related implementations in the applet. But 90% of the times, the applet vendor is, essentially relying on you to do the groundwork, and they shouldn't have to go through the whole gamut of requirements. So just to reduce the scope as much as possible. And if UPDT already does it, great, but I was just really focused on, defining a separate test suite so that a lab knows, almost like a checklist, right? They go through that specifically when they have an applet vendor come to them. And to your point of reuse, base work is already done by the single chip. So they should really have to, there needs to be a way to trust that. And that's where CMBP seal comes into the picture, and then just do the delta work.
So I guess two other comments. So in the binding example, one of the challenges we have there is that if you bind at the boundary of the Java card OS, then ultimately if you're a level 3, say, you need to encrypt the CSPs across that boundary. And that then creates an inefficiency where you're encrypting things between the operating system and the applet. And that all just kind of goes wrong very quick.
Right.
You'll find that with pretty much all the Java card OS or the Java card related certifications for FIPS today, based on how the industry has worked for literally decades, they typically certify demo applet running on top of the Java card OS.
Right.
So as part of adding a new applet to the card, you also need to think about how it needs to replicate all the features that are in the demo applet.
Right.
Where I guess from experience that you could well find crypto in there, and various other interesting things that need to be replicated.
Okay.
So I think most of the times we've come against this as a decision, just based on the sunset date stuff, we typically end up having to do just start again. But maybe with some shortcuts whereby if you use the same lab, then they can possibly reuse test results, although that's becoming a more difficult thing to do.
So unfortunately, even then, right, even if you use the same lab, the lab's hands are tied right now, so they still have to go through the whole, like, plethora of requirements, the whole gamut again and retest. So yes, you're familiar with the testing, then you have to work with the SOC vendor to help you get there in terms of the automated tests that they would have run as part of their validation and so on. But really, there has to be, so the sort of gap that I see, and maybe I'm missing something here, is where the certificate has expired, but if nothing has changed, right, there should be a way, sort of like a UPDT, right, to essentially revalidate it as part of an applet validation. So I'm not saying that the base certificate will renew or anything like that, but just because that expired, right, and I'm bound to it in one way or another, I shouldn't have to sort of meet the additional requirements, etc. If nothing has changed from a FIPS perspective, I should still be able to do the delta work, even if my base cert is on the historical list, right, and then say, okay, this is a new cert based on this because nothing has changed. Even if the single chip vendor doesn't decide to do anything about their own cert and keep it on the historical list.
Yeah, I guess
unpopular opinion, but just, yeah.
Arguing against a utopian world and an improvement, I mean, it is a challenging world as to how to get from the base card certifications to consuming certifications. If there is anything that can be done to avoid starting again, then great, but I think that for many reasons is something that pretty commonly happens and is accepted.
Right. So the idea really with this, and I fully understand that this is sort of restarting a conversation. It's by no means like a new topic. For those of us who have been involved with single chip validations in the past and applet validations, but what I envision is working with the applet vendors, again, through CMUF to almost sort of formulate, to your point, a template and a suite of tests, right? So it's agnostic, lab agnostic, essentially. So that's your test suite, regardless of whether you're, applet A versus applet B vendor, lab A versus lab Z. You just, go to that test suite, almost like one that was defined by CMVP for like a one-sub, right? So it would be a set test, except that we would actually want to work on the scripts as well, so that the evidence that it's going to produce, of course, is the same across the board, right? And CMVP over time will recognize what they're looking at, and it's that much simpler for a CMVP reviewer. And if there's corner cases, sure, we might have to do a one-off and actually do a UPDT, right, if we don't cover all ground.
Yeah, so going back to the whole MC PVP thing, maybe what you could do there would be, as part of the base certification, you create these packages of evidence for the stuff that's reusable. Be it the physical security or anything to do with the Java card OS. And I guess with the things it's talking about there, demo applet is kind of a bit of a Pandora's box with regards to how to deal with that as part of, if you've got a new module and it's gone, how do you know that you've accounted for all the things that were in it if you replace it with something else? But I think that there's ways to do the base certification in different ways, such that it's easier to add to going forward. But I think it's probably both the how do you cert the Java card OS and create evidence that can be reused and information you need, plus the secure IC, as well as how do you get to a more efficient way to adding to that platform. But that could just be a UPDT. I don't necessarily know that that's a unique thing to Java cards.
Yeah, so this by no means is completely flushed out, and like I said, there would be those two parallel tracks we'd have to consider, because not every single applet is going to fall in the bucket where there's zero crypto, right? But for those of them who do, it's really the overhead that we want to cut down on, right? Because they shouldn't have to do what like a Thales or an XP already have. So that's basically where this comes in. And to your point, I think what you presented, of course, is like the umbrella, and this is, the way I see it, this would be like a special case scenario from that, right? So yeah, so because this is being recorded, shout out to Costa, and if you're interested in learning more about reuse, do check the presentation out. He presented right before me. Any other questions or anything to add? Yeah, my question to you, Graham, essentially was how a lab could help, but I think we can just connect via CMUF on that. Yep. Okay, so yeah, you can do a drinks break then. Thank you. Have a good one.